You have walked on Canada cement every day of your life. The sidewalk outside your house, the curb your school bus pulled up to, the pavement of every Trans-Canada Highway exit between St. John's and Victoria, the concrete piers of the bridges, the locks of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the 40,000 cubic meters holding up the CN Tower. At its peak, the Canada Cement Company controlled 3/4 of the cement made in Canada, with 11 plants from the Bow Valley to the Bay of Quinte and 13,000 mostly Canadian shareholders. They survived the panic of 1907 that created them, survived 2 world wars, survived the Depression, the oil shock, and a Quebec-wide political revolution. And then, on the 1st of January 1988, the name on every bag came down. How does a company whose product you have touched every day of your life simply vanish from public memory? What happened? Chapter 1. The Manse Boy from Newcastle. The story begins not in Montreal, where the deal was struck, but in a Presbyterian manse on the Miramichi River in northern New Brunswick. The year is 1880. The Dominion of Canada is 13 years old. The Intercolonial Railway has just stitched the Maritimes to central Canada, with steel rails laid through bog and granite, and a Scottish-born minister named William Cuthbert Aitken has moved his growing family from Maple, Ontario, to a parish in Newcastle, a logging and shipbuilding town near the mouth of the river. His second son, born the year before in Ontario, is barely walking. The boy's name is William Maxwell Aitken. Everyone calls him Max. Newcastle in those years was a small place doing big business. The Miramichi was one of the great salmon rivers of the British Empire, and the schooners that loaded square timber on its banks sailed for Liverpool and Glasgow with cargoes that fed the shipyards of the old country. The town had a Presbyterian church, an Anglican one, a Catholic one for the Irish, and a synagogue would come later. It had hotels, a newspaper, lawyers, and the steady cold of a maritime winter that taught children to walk on planks across snowdrifts taller than they were. Max Aitken grew up in this place, the second of 10 children in a household where the father preached on the conduct of a Christian life, and the mother, Jane Noble, ran a manse on a minister's salary. He was not what his father had hoped for. The elder Aitken wanted a scholar. Max wanted a deal. By the time he was 13, he had founded a school paper called The Leader and was acting as the local correspondent for the St. John's Sun, sending dispatches by mail down the rail line, pocketing the modest fees, and learning, before most boys his age had learned long division, that information could be turned into money. He sold newspaper subscriptions door to door. He ran a small trade in books. He watched the men of Newcastle the way other boys watched the river, looking for the eddies where something might be caught. He failed at school in the way bright, restless children fail. He sat the Dalhousie entrance examinations and refused to write the Greek and Latin papers, on the grounds that classical languages were of no possible use to a man who intended to make his fortune. The university refused him. He registered at King's College Law School. He did not stay. He clerked in the law office of a young Chatham barrister named Richard Bedford Bennett, who would one day be Prime Minister of Canada, and the two formed a friendship that lasted half a century. A friendship between 2 ambitious maritime boys who looked at the Dominion's industrial centers in the south and saw their futures laid out like a road. He was fired, by one account, for poor concentration. He drifted west to Calgary, where Bennett had gone, and ran a bowling alley. He drifted to Edmonton. He drifted home. He was 21 years old and had nothing but a sharp mind, a quick tongue, and a conviction that he was meant for something larger than the manse and the snow. What rescued him was Halifax. In 1900, he walked into the offices of John Fitzwilliam Stairs, of the city's dominant merchant and banking family, and asked for work. Stairs was the most powerful businessman in the Maritimes, a man whose name was on banks, on shipping companies, on insurance houses, and on most of the trade in sugar and rope that moved through the port. He saw something in the young Aitken that the law office in Chatham had missed. He took him on. He trained him in the mechanics of finance, in how a bond was floated, in how a holding company was structured, in how a man with no capital of his own could nonetheless wield other people's money to assemble entire industries. When Stairs launched the Royal Securities Corporation in 1903, he made Max Aitken a minority shareholder and the firm's general manager. Aitken was 24. 18 months later, Stairs was suddenly dead, struck down by a heart attack on a Halifax street, and the young general manager, by force of will and the timing of an undertaker, found himself in control of the firm. He moved it to Montreal, the business capital of Canada, and he began to do what he had been waiting his whole life to do. He made deals. By 30, he was a millionaire. He had organized the Montreal Engineering Company in 1907, one of the first consulting engineering firms in the world. He had launched Calgary Power, which would one day be TransAlta, building the Horseshoe Falls Hydro Station on the Bow River. He had interests in tramways in Cuba and Puerto Rico. He had a wife, Gladys Drury, daughter of a Canadian general, and a house in Montreal's Square Mile, the few streets of stone mansions along the southern slope of Mount Royal, where the men who owned the railways and the banks and the shipping lines lived behind wrought iron gates. And he had a method. Aitken had learned, watching Stairs, that the great fortunes of the new century would not be made by building factories one at a time. They would be made by taking the dozens of small, struggling factories that already existed in any given trade, too many for the market, all of them cutting each other's prices, and welding them into a single combine, a trust, a monopoly. One company where there had been 20. One stock issue where there had been 20 balance sheets to balance. And in the gap between what the underlying plants were worth and what the new combine could be sold for on the market, a promoter with nerve could pocket a fortune. He had already tried this with Stelco, the steel company of Canada, organizing the merger that would eventually anchor industrial Hamilton. He had tried it with Canadian Car and Foundry, the railway rolling stock combine. Between 1909 and 1913, he would be involved in roughly 40 major Canadian industrial consolidations, the first great merger wave in the country's history. 200 firms folded into about 50. But the deal that would define him, that would put his name in every newspaper from Halifax to Vancouver, and ultimately drive him into permanent exile, was the one he turned to in the spring of 1909. The cement industry was in trouble, and a minister's son from Newcastle was about to discover that the powder under everyone's feet was worth more than anyone had yet imagined. Chapter 2. 10 Plants into One. To understand what Aitken did in the summer of 1909, you have to understand the cement business as it stood that year. Portland cement, the gray powder that, mixed with water and aggregate, becomes concrete, had been the miracle material of the late 19th century. The recipe was straightforward enough. Limestone and clay, ground together, burned in a kiln at temperatures hot enough to glow white, then ground again into a fine gray dust. What changed everything was the rotary kiln, a long inclined cylinder that turned slowly while the raw mix tumbled through a wall of flame, replacing the old vertical kilns that had to be charged and emptied by hand. By 1900, the rotary kiln had crossed from England and Germany into North America, and any town with limestone in the ground and a railway running past it was a candidate for a cement plant. Canada had limestone in abundance. The Ordovician seabeds of southern Ontario, the Trenton Formation along the Bay of Quinte, the Bow Valley in Alberta, the cliffs above Owen Sound. The country was ringed with the material. And so, between 1900 and 1907, plants went up. In Hull, Quebec, on the Ottawa River. In Belleville, Ontario, twice, one company on each side of town. In Marlbank and Port Colborne and Lakefield and Shallow Lake. In Calgary and Exshaw. By 1908, there were perhaps a dozen modern Portland cement works in operation across the Dominion, and behind them, another half-dozen older mills running on the obsolete vertical kiln technology. There was too much of everything. The panic of 1907, the Great Wall Street crash that ran from New York up the railway lines into Canadian boardrooms, cut the demand for cement nearly in half almost overnight. Construction stopped. Grain elevators went unbuilt. The plants kept running because shutting down a rotary kiln was nearly as expensive as keeping it lit, and they sold their product at whatever the market would bear. By the winter of 1908, cement was being dumped on the docks at Montreal and Toronto at prices below the cost of production. Every plant in the country was bleeding. The bloodiest of them was Western Canada Cement and Coal, a modern works at Exshaw, Alberta, in a high pass of the Bow Valley between Banff and Calgary. The plant had been built in 1906 to a design by an engineer named Robert D. Hassan, with 6 80-foot rotary kilns capable of turning out as much as 1,800 barrels a day. It was capitalized in London. Its honorary president was perhaps the most respected engineer in the country, Sir Sandford Fleming. Fleming was a national institution. Scottish-born, he had come to Canada in 1845 and had built much of what made it a country: the intercolonial railway through New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, much of the Canadian Pacific surveying through the Rockies, the proposal for worldwide standard time, the first Canadian postage stamp. By 1909, he was 82 years old, white-bearded, knighted, semi-retired, and lending his name to the kind of new ventures that needed credibility in the London markets. The Exshaw plant was meant to be one of those ventures. The town itself was named for E. William Exshaw, his son-in-law. By the spring of 1909, Western Canada Cement was broke. Its British bondholders were owed hundreds of thousands. Its largest Canadian creditor was the Bank of Montreal, and the bank's general manager and vice president, Sir Edward Seaborn Clouston, himself a shareholder in Royal Securities, was watching the position with the particular concern of a man who has lent money to a borrower who cannot pay. Clouston picked up the telephone. He called Max Aitken in his Montreal offices. He suggested a meeting. What Aitken proposed was not a rescue. It was a consolidation. If Western Canada Cement was failing because there was too much cement in Canada, the solution was not to save Western Canada Cement. The solution was to buy every modern cement plant in the Dominion and run them all as one company, a single producer that could set its own prices, close the worst plants, and pay back the Bank of Montreal in dividends rather than write-offs. He would do for cement what he was already doing for steel. He began the negotiations in April. He traveled by train through the Ottawa Valley and along the Bay of Quinte and up the Owen Sound line, meeting each plant owner in turn. He had a method, witnesses recalled, that was as much social as financial. He would sit in a man's drawing room and listen, ask after the wife and children, talk about hockey and the weather and the price of barley, and then, near the end of an afternoon, pull out a sheet of paper and offer terms. He offered shares in a new combine. He offered cash. He offered, above all, the chance to walk away from a business that was killing everyone in it. By July, he had agreements with the owners of every modern plant in the country. The list, when it was published that autumn, ran to 10 companies: the International Portland Cement Company at Hull, Quebec, the Vulcan Portland Cement Company at Montreal, the Lehigh Portland Cement Company and the Belleville Portland Cement Company, both at Belleville, Ontario, the Canadian Portland Cement Company at Marlbank, and another Canadian Portland at Port Colborne. The Lakefield Portland operations, one at Lakefield and another in Montreal, the Owen Sound Portland Cement Company at Shallow Lake, and the Alberta Portland Cement Company at Calgary. 10 plants, roughly 4/5 of all the cement made in Canada, folded into a single corporate shell, incorporated on the 10th of September, 1909, and given a name that announced its ambition with no apology at all: the Canada Cement Company, Limited. The numbers were dazzling and, to those who looked closely, troubling. The properties paid for in cash and shares were valued at around $13.5 million. The new companies issued securities, common stock, preferred stock, bonds, came to almost $29 million. The gap was the promoter's profit, and the promoter was Max Aitken. The press called it watered stock. Aitken called it the value the merger had created. Both were partly right. He was 30 years old. He had just built the largest industrial combine in Canadian history, and he had not yet acquired the one plant whose owner would, within months, try to destroy him. Chapter 3. Fleming's Revenge. Sir Sandford Fleming had agreed to the principle of the merger, but he had not agreed to the terms. He held shares in the International Portland Cement Company at Hull, which had gone into the combine on what he considered acceptable conditions. But he was also the honorary president of Western Canada Cement and Coal at Exshaw, the plant Clouston had wanted rescued in the first place, and on that company Aitken was uncompromising. Western Canada Cement was carrying a great deal of debt. Before it could enter Canada Cement, the British bondholders would have to take a write-down. They would have to accept less than they were owed. Fleming put the proposition to them, and they refused. They had bought British bonds in a British-financed Alberta venture, and they expected to be paid in full. Aitken set a deadline, the 1st of February, 1910. If by that date the bondholders had not agreed to reduce their securities, Western Canada Cement would be left out of the merger, and Canada Cement would proceed without it. The deadline came. The bondholders did not move. Fleming, who had taken on the role of negotiating on their behalf, came back to Aitken and asked for easier terms. He was rebuffed. What happened next has been argued about for more than a century. By Fleming's account, he discovered in the course of his negotiations that the new Canada Cement Company had issued roughly $12 million of securities to Aitken personally as his promoter's profit. He believed this had been concealed from the original prospectus and from the merging shareholders, and that the inflation of the company's capital structure would, in time, starve the underlying plants of the cash they needed for upkeep. He believed, in the language of the period, that the company had been robbed. He demanded an investigation. The board, including Aitken, agreed. 2 investigators were appointed. One of them, by Fleming's insistence, his own lawyer. The investigation took place over the spring of 1910. The report, delivered in July, concluded that Canada Cement had not been robbed. Fleming rejected the conclusion. He proposed instead to revive Western Canada Cement as a competitor and to operate the Exshaw plant in opposition to the combine. By this point, Aitken was in London. He had made his first transatlantic crossing in 1908 and had liked what he saw. In the spring of 1910, he had moved his family permanently to England. From a suite of offices on the edge of the city, he now did what he had always done best. He went around the obstacle. He approached the British bondholders directly, without Fleming as intermediary, and persuaded them that something was better than nothing. They agreed to sell at a discount. In January 1911, Western Canada Cement was liquidated, and the Exshaw plant was transferred to Canada Cement for less than $1.5 million. Fleming was left out entirely. He did not take it quietly. He printed a circular condemning Aitken and circulated it among the shareholders. He publicly resigned the honorary presidency of Canada Cement. He petitioned Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Prime Minister of Canada, for a royal commission of inquiry. On the 12th of May, 1911, in a sensation that made the front page of the Ottawa Evening Journal, his case was read into the proceedings of the House of Commons. The company, Fleming charged, had effected an extraordinary misappropriation of capital by deliberate artifice under the guise of law. He warned the holders of Canada Cement's 7% preference stock against a bill before Parliament that would replace their preferred shares with $11 million of debenture stock. He was 84 years old, and he was fighting in public to expose what he believed to be a fraud. He never got his inquiry. What he got instead was an arrangement. The historian Gregory Marchildon, who in 1996 published the definitive study of Aitken's Canadian career, makes the case as follows. Aitken was guilty of stock watering. There is no question about that. But by the standards of the 1909 to 1913 merger wave, in which roughly 200 Canadian firms were folded into about 50, the Canada Cement promotion was no more egregious than the average and considerably less than Fleming alleged. The real political danger of an inquiry was not to Aitken. It was to Sir Edward Clouston of the Bank of Montreal, who had brought Aitken into the deal in the first place, and whose conflict of interest, bank creditor, Royal Securities shareholder, merger sponsor, would have made awkward reading in a Royal Commission's report. To protect Clouston, Aitken made a private bargain with the Laurier government. He would stay in Britain. He would not return to Canada to defend himself. He would let the inquiry die quietly. In exchange, the government would allow it to die. The bargain was kept. Laurier lost the September 1911 reciprocity election to Robert Borden, partly on the wave of populist resentment that the Canada Cement affair had helped to stoke. The Combines Investigation Act, drafted by Laurier's Labour Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in response to the merger wave, passed into law. and Max Aitken, knighted in 1911 by the new Conservative government, elected to the Westminster Parliament in December 1910 for the riding of Ashton-under-Lyne with the help of his fellow New Brunswicker Andrew Bonar Law, became, for the rest of his life, a British figure. He never lived in Canada again. Sandford Fleming died in 1915. Some accounts hold that the strain of the cement fight contributed to his decline, though he was already in his late 80s and had been failing for some time. His name remained on schools and parks and a passenger ferry, and on the standard time zones he had proposed for the world. The name of the company he had tried to destroy did not, in 1911, mean very much to ordinary Canadians. Within 10 years, it would mean a great deal indeed. Within 40, it would be everywhere. And within 80, it would be gone. But that was a long way off. In 1911, Max Aitken was sailing east. The plants he had assembled were beginning to run. The cement was beginning to flow. And somewhere out on the eastern townships of Quebec, in the Bow Valley, in the Ontario limestone country, men were arriving at the gates of the new company's works to build a dominion in concrete. Chapter 4. A Lord in London. The man who built Canada Cement spent the company's first half-century watching it from across the Atlantic. Sir Max Aitken, by 1917, the first Baron Beaverbrook, named for a stream that ran past the Newcastle manse where he had grown up, settled in England and proceeded to remake himself a second time. He bought a controlling interest in the Daily Express in 1916 and built it, over the next 2 decades, into the largest circulation newspaper on earth. He ran Britain's wartime Ministry of Information in 1918, commissioning paintings of the Canadian Corps from Augustus John and A.Y. Jackson and Fred Varley and Wyndham Lewis, founding the Canadian War Memorials Fund that still hangs in the National Gallery in Ottawa. He served as a Conservative MP, sat in the House of Lords, made and broke prime ministers in the smoky drawing rooms of his Surrey estate at Chirkley Court. In 1940, when Winston Churchill needed someone to ram a fighter aircraft production program through a tired and divided British industry, he reached for Beaverbrook. Through the Battle of Britain summer, the manse boy from Miramichi served as Minister of Aircraft Production. Churchill wrote afterwards that his personal force and genius had made it Aitken's finest hour. He sold his Canadian securities business to Isaac Walton Killam in 1919 and never owned a controlling share of Canada Cement again. He left behind, in Montreal, a board of directors drawn from the city's English-speaking establishment and a succession of presidents who would run the company in his absence for the next half-century. Charles Hazlitt Cahan held the chair briefly in 1909 and 1910. William Cameron Edwards followed him and died in office in 1921. Frank Percy Jones ran the company through the boom of the 1920s. Arthur Charles Tagg took over in 1927 and saw it through the worst years of the Depression. John David Johnson was president from 1931 to 1948 and then chairman until 1962, a 31-year tenure that covered the war, the post-war boom, and the building of the Seaway. None of them were household names. None of them were meant to be. The company's name was Canada Cement, and the country was the brand. The First World War found the company 2 years old and the plants running flat out. There were forts to pour at Halifax and Quebec. There were munitions plants going up in Ontario. There was, in 1916, the second collapse of the partially built Quebec Bridge, a span across the St. Lawrence, whose first attempt, in 1907, had killed 75 men, most of them Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake, and whose second attempt killed 13 more when the center suspended span fell into the river during a lift. When the bridge was finally completed and opened in 1919, its rebuilt cantilever piers and approaches were poured in concrete from Canada Cement plants. The longest cantilever span in the world stood on the company's product. So did the new dry docks at Halifax, rebuilt after the December 1917 explosion that flattened the north end of the city. The 1920s were a decade of building. The grain harvest moved by rail, and elevators went up across the prairies, each one a tower of poured concrete with the company's bills behind it. Montreal added neighborhoods west and north. Toronto pushed its streetcar lines into farmland, The Canada Cement Building rose at the corner of Phillips Square in 1921 and 1922. 10 stories of reinforced concrete dressed in hand-tooled granite, designed by the architects Barat and Blackadder. The architect Ernest Barat had persuaded the company's directors to use concrete for the structure itself rather than steel, to make the head office, in effect, an advertisement for its own product. It was the first all-concrete office tower in Montreal. From 1922 to 1927, it housed Marconi's CFCF, the first English-language radio station in the city, whose announcers read the markets from the upper floors, while the cement men did their accounts on the floors below. The Depression hit cement hard. New construction collapsed. The plants ran short hours, or not at all. What kept the industry alive through the worst years was government work. The fourth Welland Ship Canal, which the country had begun in 1913 and finished in 1932, with 3.5 million cubic yards of concrete in its locks and piers. And the great Beauharnois power development west of Montreal, a kilometer-long concrete dam and powerhouse on the St. Lawrence begun in 1929 and producing electricity by 1932. When Governor-General Lord Beaverbrook opened the Welland Canal on the 6th of August, 1932, the procession passed through a chain of locks whose walls were Canada Cement product. By then, the company had 10 years of payments left on its Phillips Square headquarters and a workforce that had been cut almost in half. The Second World War brought the kilns back to full heat. There were airfields to pour for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. By 1944, there were 107 flying training schools and bombing and gunnery schools across Canada, almost all of them ringed with concrete runways and aprons. There were shipyards in Halifax and on the Pacific coast. There were aluminum smelters at Arvida and chemical works at Trail. And there was, in Montreal, a slow change in the workforce. Women on the bagging lines, refugees from Italy and Poland and Hungary on the kiln crews, French-Canadian men out of the rural parishes north of the St. Lawrence walking into the company's eastern Quebec plants and signing on for whatever was offered. In London, the man who had built it all watched the war from cabinet rank and never came home. When the cement that had poured the Welland Canal and the Quebec Bridge began to pour the Seaway and the Trans-Canada Highway in the 1950s, Max Aitken, the first Baron Beaverbrook, was a man in his 70s, presiding over a newspaper empire and a country house and a private quarrel with most of the British establishment. He visited Newcastle, New Brunswick, when he could. He gave the town a library and an arts center, and the bronze bust of himself that stands in its central square. He gave the University of New Brunswick at Fredericton enough money to remake it. He died in June 1964 at Cherkley Court, aged 85, and was cremated. His ashes were placed in the plinth of his own bust in Newcastle's town square, looking out across the river he had crossed in his boyhood to sell newspapers. The company he had assembled in a Montreal hotel room in 1909 was, by then, the largest cement maker in Canada and producing more product than at any time in its history. He had given it the shape it would carry for the rest of its life. The men who ran it had taken his combine and made it into something he himself had never quite seen. Not a financial instrument, not a stock watering scheme, but a working industrial company with plants in 9 provinces and a customer list that read like the gazetteer of modern Canada. Chapter 5. Plant number 1. Drive east out of downtown Montreal in 1954, along the river road that follows the St. Lawrence toward the refineries, and after about 20 minutes, you would come to a low industrial sprawl at Pointe-aux-Trembles, where the limestone cliffs ran down to the water, a series of gray buildings, a set of squat round storage silos, and a stack tall enough to be visible from the Champlain Bridge. This was Canada Cement's plant number 1, the Montreal East Works, and in that year, it produced 30% of all the cement made in Canada. One plant, 3 of every 10 bags. The argillaceous limestone came out of a quarry that ran along the back of the site like a long gray wound in the earth, and conveyors carried it under the road into the plant proper, where the rotary kilns, long inclined cylinders, the largest of them nearly 500 feet from end to end, turned slowly day and night, while gas flames roared inside them at temperatures around 2,600 degrees. A man arriving for the 7 o'clock shift on a January morning would walk from the parking lot through air so cold his eyelashes froze together if he blinked too slowly. He would punch in at the gatehouse, hand his metal lunch pail to the timekeeper to be checked, and step into the changing rooms where steam from 100 showers hung in the air like fog. The work clothes hanging on the hooks were gray at the shoulders, and gray at the cuffs, and gray wherever a man had wiped his hands on them for 10 or 15 or 25 years, because the dust got into everything, into the fabric, into the leather of the boots, into the lines of a worker's face, into the air the wives of Pointe-aux-Trembles wiped from their kitchen windowsills every Saturday morning. The company gave out a fresh towel each shift. By the end of the towel's day, it would be the color of a wet sidewalk. Inside the kiln house, the temperature swung the other way. In winter, the walls were lined with frost on the outside, and the kiln casings glowed dull red on the inside. The men who worked the burner end stripped to their undershirts in a building where the outside temperature was -25. The noise was a low, continuous roar, layered with the rumble of the kiln itself, turning on its bearings, slow enough that a man could count its rotations if he stood still for 30 seconds. The smell was a smell with no analog outside a cement works: hot lime and burning coke, and a metallic edge from the steel of the kiln shell, the whole of it dry. The kind of dryness that cracked the inside of your nose by 10 o'clock if you weren't careful. The old hands chewed peppermint gum to keep their mouths moist. The new men learned to within a week. You moved through the plant by stages. First the quarry, where the dynamite crews loaded shot holes in the limestone face at dawn, and the daily blast at noon shook the windows of the houses on the bluff above. Then the primary crusher, a steel-jawed machine the size of a small house, where boulders the size of armchairs came in at one end and gravel came out the other. Then the raw mill, where the gravel was ground to powder and mixed with the clay slurry that came in by pipe from the deposit further inland. Then the kiln, the heart of it, where the raw mix tumbled down through the flame and emerged at the far end as hard gray nodules called clinker. Then the clinker silos and the finish mill, where the clinker was ground with a small percentage of gypsum into the fine gray dust that was Portland cement. Then the bagging line and the bulk loaders, the rail cars and the cement trucks pulling in under the silos to take their load and then pulling out again, heading north into the city, east toward the refineries, west across the bridges, south toward the border. A man named Réal Lemieux ran one of the kilns at Plant Number 1 for 31 years, from 1948 to 1979. A Beauce farm boy who had come to Montreal in his 20s looking for work and had walked through the Canada Cement Gate one Tuesday afternoon and never walked back out for anything but Sundays. He knew the sound of his kiln. He could tell from across the room when the flame had drifted, when the feed rate was wrong, when the clinker coming out at the cold end was about to come out either too soft or too hard. He spoke to the kiln in French in the early years and Spanish in the later years, after his Spanish-speaking assistants began arriving from the Antilles and South America in the 1960s, and the kiln, by all accounts, listened. The shift change was the great daily event. At 3 in the afternoon and again at 11 at night, the gates would open and one workforce would walk out and another would walk in. And for 15 minutes, the road outside the plant was a slow river of men in gray jackets walking against each other and saying the few things that needed to be said between shifts. The kiln is running hot. The number 2 mill needs attention. Your brother-in-law is looking for you. There was an Italian community in Pointe-aux-Trembles by the 1950s and a Portuguese one by the 1960s, and the language of the floor was French, laced with a dozen accents. The cafeteria on the second floor of the administration building had 3 lunch settings, 11, 12, and 1, and you ate with the men of your own shift and your own department, and the soup, by general agreement, was poor. At Exshaw in the Bow Valley, the rhythm was slower and the geography larger. 6 80-foot rotary kilns running at 1,500 barrels a day, in a long, low building set against a cliff of gray limestone that towered 800 feet above the plant. The Bow River ran past the front gate, blue-green and cold, even in August. The Trans-Canada Highway, when it came through in the 1950s, passed within sight of the works. In winter, the plant put out a banner of steam visible for 30 kilometers against the snowfields of the Three Sisters. The men who worked the kilns at Exshaw were drawn from a population of Polish coal miners who had come down from Bankhead and Canmore when those collieries closed, from Italian masons who had finished their work on the Banff hotels and looked for something steadier, and from a steady stream of Albertan farm boys who needed a winter wage. They lived in the company town a few hundred yards from the gates, in small frame houses on Portland Avenue and the streets that ran perpendicular to it, in a settlement built by the company and serviced by the company, and recognized by no provincial map as anything other than what it was, an unincorporated industrial hamlet at the foot of a mountain, run by the men who ran the plant. Chapter 6. The Cement Towns. There were Canada cement towns from one end of the country to the other, but the two that mattered most, the two whose memory survives most clearly in the photographs and the local histories and the names of the children who grew up there, were Exshaw, Alberta, and a place on the Bay of Quinte called Point Anne. Point Anne, Ontario, was Canada Cement's plant number 5, and at one point, the second largest cement works in the country. It sat on a low promontory east of Belleville, on the Bay of Quinte, where the Trenton limestone came right up to the surface and could be quarried at almost no cost. The two pre-merger cement companies in the area, Belleville Portland and Lehigh Portland, had been consolidated by Canada Cement in 1914 into a single operation. And around that operation, the company had built one of the most complete company towns in Canadian industrial history. About 100 houses laid out on a grid above the works, all built of decorative cement block manufactured at the plant, all owned by the company, all rented to its men. There was a clubhouse and a tennis court. There was a ball diamond where the company-sponsored softball team, the Canada Cementmen, played their summer schedule, and where, in 1939, they took the Ontario Championship in a final played out under floodlights paid for by the Works Office. There was a heated outdoor hockey rink in the winter, kept smooth by night crews on snow machines, and the rink was where, on the 3rd of January 1939, a plant number 5 worker named Robert Hull took his newborn son out for the boys' first look at ice. The boy's name was Robert Marvin Hull. The world would come to know him as Bobby, the Golden Jet, winner of 3 Hart trophies, the man who took the slap shot from oddity to weapon, 50 goals a year with the Chicago Blackhawks. His younger brother Dennis, born in the same Plant 5 row house in November 1944, would play for Team Canada in the Summit Series of 1972. Both of them learned to skate on a rink the cement company had frozen for its workers' children. Point Anne produced more than hockey players. The Impressionist painter Manly Edward MacDonald, whose canvases of the Bay of Quinte hang in the Art Gallery of Hamilton and the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton, was born there in 1889 and worked as a young man at the Belleville Portland kilns before going to study in New York. The hydroplane racer Murney Carter, who set Canadian records on the bay in the 1950s, grew up in a Plant 5 row house. The independent town site, just outside the company fence, had a general store run by F. Malik, a notion shop run by the Harb family, Lebanese immigrants who had come to the Bay of Quinte in the 1920s, and grocers named G.J. Graves and R. Howard, whose advertisements ran in the Belleville papers through the 1930s and 1940s. Multi-generational labor was the rule, not the exception. Stephen Henry Shepard, born in 1887, worked at the plant from before the merger until the late 1940s. His son, Chester Charles Shepard, born in 1920, started on the bagging line in 1937 and stayed for 41 years. Chester's father-in-law, Bertram Mortimer Lloyd, born in 1896, worked alongside him on the kiln crew. Chester's wife, Clara, remembered, all her life, that she and Chester used to climb up onto their garage roof every couple of years and chip the accumulated cement dust off the shingles, because the weight of it would otherwise crack the rafters. When the plant eventually closed, she and Chester bought their company house from the works, and Chester became chairman of the Point Anne Water Commission. He died in 2006. Clara outlived him by some years and was, for a while, the last keeper of the memory. Exshaw was the same story written against a different landscape. The settlement had grown up in 1906 around Sanford Fleming's Western Canada cement plant, with the company importing, by one account preserved in the works archives, 300 young men, some with their families, from across Europe and the British Isles, to build the original works. By the 1950s, it was a community of Polish and Italian and British families living in small wood-frame houses along Portland Avenue and the side streets, with a schoolhouse for the elementary grades, a Protestant chapel called St. Bernard's that had been built in 1907 and stood with its plain wooden bell tower at the head of the main street, a movie theater that ran 2 films a week, a bowling alley with 5 lanes, and a skating rink that the company flooded every November. There was a welder at the Exshaw plant, whose name appears in the local histories and in the memory of half the families in the valley. Secondo Mario Smaniotto, born in 1920 at Lower Bankhead, the abandoned coal mining settlement up the valley. To Italian immigrant parents, who had gone back to Italy with his family as a boy, fought in the Italian army through the Second World War, and then returned to Alberta in the early 1950s and walked through the gate at the Canada Cement Exshaw plant to ask for a job. He stayed for the rest of his working life. He was an artist as well as a tradesman. He wrought the iron gates that hung at the entrance to St. Bernard's Chapel. He circled the world to end up back here, his son-in-law Robert Kangas said of him afterwards. The phrase could have been the epigraph for half the men who worked at the Bow Valley plant. These towns were not idyllic. The dust was a constant. The shift work wore men out before they were 50. The company houses were the companies, and a man who quit or was fired had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. There were strikes at Point Anne in the 1930s and 1940s, organized in part by the United Cement, Lime and Gypsum Workers International Union, and there were periods of bitter relations between the works manager and the men on the bagging line. There were industrial accidents, some of them fatal, that the company papers reported in 3 or 4 lines on an inside page. But these were real communities with hockey teams and church suppers and Friday night dances at the Union Hall, and the men and women who lived in them built their lives around a kiln stack that they could see from any front porch. A stack that said to them every day that the work was steady and the wages were paid and the cement was going out by rail and truck to a country that needed every barrel. Chapter 7. What the country was pouring. To understand what Canada Cement meant to the country during the high years between the end of the Second World War and the late 1960s, set aside the dust and the kilns for a moment and consider what Canada was building. In the summer of 1954, construction began on the joint Canadian-American project to deepen and widen the St. Lawrence between Montreal and Lake Ontario, a chain of locks and channels and dams that would allow ocean-going ships to reach Thunder Bay and Duluth, and that would, as a side benefit, generate enough electricity at the Moses Saunders and Beauharnois powerhouses to light most of central Canada. The St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project was one of the largest civil engineering undertakings of the 20th century. It employed, at its peak, 22,000 workers. It removed 210 million cubic yards of earth and rock, and it poured into its locks, dams, and powerhouses more than 6 million cubic yards of concrete. Enough, the Encyclopedia Britannica would write afterwards, to build a highway 1,600 kilometers long. Canada Cement supplied the great bulk of the Canadian side cement. The company had, in that year, somewhere around 75% of the Canadian market. There was no other supplier large enough to feed a project at that scale. The St. Lawrence Seaway opened in June 1959. By that time, the country was halfway through another national project that would consume an even greater volume of cement in the end. The Trans-Canada Highway Act had been passed in 1949 and signed by Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent. By the early 1960s, the pavement had reached most of the way across the country, and by 1971, it would be officially open from St. John's, Newfoundland, to Victoria, British Columbia, 7,800 kilometers of road, of which a substantial portion was poured concrete, and almost all of which used cement for its bridges, its culverts, its grade separations. In 1956, in a small administrative footnote that captured the era, a property the company owned at Anthracite, Alberta, an old coal mining site that had once been a town, was expropriated and incorporated into the Trans-Canada Highway route. The road ran straight over the company's land. There were the hydroelectric dams. Beauharnois expanded again between 1948 and 1953. The Manicouagan and Outardes complexes in northern Quebec begun in 1959 and completed in the late 1960s. Among them, the Great Manic 5 Dam, a multiple-arched buttress structure with a crest more than 1,000 meters long, whose construction required so much cement that Canada Cement built a temporary plant at the site to keep up with demand. Churchill Falls in Labrador, begun in 1966, eventually one of the largest hydroelectric installations in the world. The WAC Bennett Dam on the Peace River in British Columbia, begun in 1961, when complete in 1968, the largest earth-filled dam on Earth at the time, but with a concrete intake and powerhouse that ran a steady cement contract for 7 years. There were the city projects. Place Ville-Marie in Montreal, the cruciform skyscraper that I.M. Pei designed for William Zeckendorf's redevelopment company on top of the open trench of the Canadian National Railway, opened in 1962 and visible from anywhere on the south slope of Mount Royal. The Toronto Dominion Centre, Mies van der Rohe's pair of black glass towers, opened in 1967 with one of the largest poured concrete cores in the country. The Montreal Metro opened in October 1966 in time for Expo, 20 kilometers of underground tunnel lined with concrete and tile. The Toronto Subway opened on the Yonge Line in 1954 and extended in the years afterward. The Montreal Olympic Village and Olympic Stadium begun in 1973 for the Games of 1976. And the great announcement of the era, the Canadian National Tower, contracted to Canada Cement in February 1973, a single-source on-site mixed pour that would, when complete in 1976, contain 40,500 cubic meters of concrete and stand as the tallest freestanding structure in the world for the next 32 years. There was the public housing of the post-war boom. There was Expo 67, 2 artificial islands in the St. Lawrence built of dredged fill and faced with concrete embankments, hosting 120 pavilions and 50 million visitors over 6 months. There was Habitat 67, Moshe Safdie's stacked concrete apartment blocks, 354 prefabricated units cast on site, every one of them poured from the same gray powder. There was nuclear power, the Pickering reactors east of Toronto, the Bruce reactors on Lake Huron, the Gentilly station downstream from Trois-Rivières, each one with a containment dome that consumed cement by the trainload. The picture was simple enough. From the late 1940s into the late 1960s, every nationally significant structure poured in Canada was, in 3 cases out of 4, poured from Canada Cement powder. The Seaway ran on it. The Trans-Canada Highway ran on it. The dams of Quebec Hydro and BC Hydro and Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro ran on it. The subways and the airports and the housing projects and the office towers and the nuclear stations ran on it. By 1956, the company had close to 13,000 shareholders, 97% of them Canadian, a national company in something closer than the merely legal sense. By 1969, on the eve of the merger that would change everything, it operated 11 plants from Quebec City to Calgary and employed roughly 4,000 men. It was, by any measure, the largest cement maker in the country. It was, by most measures, one of the largest industrial firms of any kind in Canada. And it was, by 1969, beginning to look across the Atlantic at a French rival who had been planning, very quietly and very patiently, to come and take it home. Chapter 8. The Summit. The summer of 1969 was the summit. From the boardroom on the upper floor of the Canada Cement building at Phillips Square, a director looking out the windows could see the Mount Royal cross above the trees, and, in the other direction, the new Place Ville-Marie Tower, and the rising shells of the Olympic projects east of downtown. The company's 11 plants were running close to capacity. Its share of Canadian cement production stood at about 3/4 of the national market. Its annual revenues had crossed the $500 million mark. Its president was James Taylor Kennedy, a measured and impressive engineer who had come up through the operations side of the business and who had taken the chair in 1968 when V.Z. Courthope Hamilton retired. Its chairman was John David Johnson, who had given the company 40 years of his working life. It looked, on the surface, indestructible. A man named Peter McIntyre, vice president of the company, attended a Montreal Board of Trade dinner in June of that year and made a short after-dinner speech that the Gazette reported on a back page. The Canadian cement industry, McIntyre said, was entering a decade of unprecedented opportunity. The Olympic project alone would consume tens of thousands of tons of cement over the next 6 years. The James Bay hydroelectric scheme, which the Quebec government had begun studying that spring, would consume hundreds of thousands more. The Trans-Canada Highway would need its expansions and its bypasses. The country, McIntyre said, was just getting started. He was not wrong about the demand. He was, by a margin of a few months, wrong about who would be selling cement to meet it. Simons Lafarge of France had entered Canada quietly in 1956. It was an old company, older than Canada Cement, founded in 1833 in the Rhone Valley by a Provençal family of lime burners who had supplied the Suez Canal and the Paris fortifications. It had opened a plant near Vancouver in 1958, bought ready-mix operations in British Columbia and Quebec through the 1960s, and built a new works at Saint-Constant on the South Shore in 1967 in time to bid on the Expo contracts. By 1969, Lafarge held about 21% of Canada Cement's shares, a stake it had been quietly accumulating through the late 1960s. And Canada Cement, in turn, held a minority interest in Lafarge Canada, the Vancouver-based subsidiary the French company had built up in the West. The two firms were, in the strange tangle that prefaced their merger, partly each other's owners. That summer, the French side made an approach. Marcel Demonque, the longtime chairman of Simons Lafarge in Paris, sent his deputy Jean-Charles L'Officier to Montreal to meet quietly with Kennedy and McIntyre at the company's offices. The proposition was simple. The two companies' Canadian operations should be combined. The new entity would have 11 plants from Vancouver Island to the Gaspé. It would dominate the national market in a way no Canadian competitor could challenge. It would have access to the technical resources of one of the largest cement firms in Europe. And it would be, in name and in head office, a Canadian company, listed in Montreal, run by a Canadian president, with the French shareholders content for the time being to hold a minority stake. Kennedy listened. So did McIntyre. So did the board. There was, even at that summit moment, a faint shadow that an attentive observer might have caught. Lafarge's annual output worldwide had doubled between 1959 and 1969. It was approaching 20 million tons a year. Its sales were running close to 5 billion French francs. Its strategy, as anyone who read the French business press could see, was global. North America was not an adventure. It was a centerpiece. Demonque and his successors were not buying minority stakes in Canada Cement as a courtesy. They were building a position. In September 1969, after a summer of negotiation, Canada Cement and Lafarge announced an agreement to merge their Canadian operations. The press releases used the language of partnership. The stock exchange announcement used the language of a transaction between equals. The chairman of the merged group, Peter McIntyre said in a written statement to the Globe and Mail, would be a Canadian. The head office would be in Montreal. The combined company would have, as its first order of business, the building of a new cement plant at Bath, Ontario, on the Bay of Quinte, a modern works to replace the aging Plant No. 5 at Point Anne, where the company's flagship Ontario operations had stood since 1914 and where the Hull brothers had learned to skate 60 years before. The shareholders of both companies approved the merger overwhelmingly. The Federal Combine's investigation branch, the same office whose existence Mackenzie King had drafted in 1910 in response to Aitken's original Canada Cement Combine, began an antitrust inquiry. In February 1970, RCMP officers visited the company's headquarters at Phillips Square to collect documents. The press in Montreal and Toronto noticed, but did not dwell on the visit. The inquiry was cleared in March. On the 1st of May, 1970, the new entity came into legal existence under the name Canada Cement Lafarge Limited. That was the summit, the highest point. The Canadian flag still flew over the head office at Phillips Square. The chairman was still a Canadian. The Bath plant was being built. The new company had 11 plants and about 4,000 workers and 3/4 of a national market in a country that was about to start building harder than it ever had before. And in Paris, In a glass-walled office on the Avenue Foch, Marcel Demonque was already running the numbers on what the next acquisition would look like. Chapter 9. The Quiet Accumulation. The 1970s began with the new company looking, on paper, very much like the old one. The name on the letterhead was Canada Cement Lafarge. The chairman was Peter McIntyre, a Canadian. The head office was on Phillips Square. The 11 plants ran on their old schedules with their old crews. At the Exshaw Works in the Bow Valley and at Plant No. 1 in Montreal East, most of the men did not even know there was anything to worry about. The pay envelopes were the same. The supervisor at the kiln was the same. The bagged cement going out by rail still said Canada Cement on the side of the sack. What had changed was the boardroom. Olivier Lecerf had arrived from Paris to take up the position of executive vice president of the merged group. He was a Lafarge man through and through, French, polished, a graduate of the École Polytechnique, the kind of executive who carried a leather briefcase and read 3 newspapers in 2 languages before breakfast. He was 40 years old. He had been groomed for a generation of management at Lafarge headquarters in Paris, and he had been sent to Montreal not to learn the Canadian business, but to begin the long process of integrating it into the French parent's global strategy. The first sign of what was coming arrived in 1972. The new company spun off a construction materials subsidiary called Canfarge Limited, consolidating its aggregates and ready-mix operations under a single roof. The shareholders barely noticed. It was the kind of corporate housekeeping that filled the back pages of the Financial Post. But it was also the first move in a pattern. The Canadian assets were being reorganized, separated, packaged, made portable. The second sign arrived in October 1973, when the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East prompted the Arab oil-producing nations to impose an embargo on shipments to countries that had supported Israel. The price of crude oil quadrupled in a few months. The price of natural gas followed it. The price of every kind of fuel that ran a cement kiln, coal, coke, gas, heavy oil, rose with it. A cement plant burns fuel by the trainload to keep its kilns at 2,600 degrees. By the spring of 1974, the cost of making a ton of cement at the Pointe-aux-Trembles works had nearly doubled. The same year, in October 1973, the new Bath plant on the Bay of Quinte fired its first kiln. And 90 kilometers to the east, at Point Anne, the old Plant No. 5 was ordered shut down. The closure of Point Anne was the first of the bulldozers. It was presented as rationalization. The new Bath Works was more efficient, more modern, closer to its raw materials, with a higher capacity than the aging Belleville area kilns could ever match. It was, by the cold logic of the balance sheet, the correct decision. What it meant in human terms was that a company town of 600 people, where the Hull brothers had been born and the Shepherds had worked across 3 generations, was given a closing notice. The company offered to sell the workers their houses. Some bought, some did not. The plant itself was demolished. The houses that nobody bought were torn down. By the end of the decade, Point Anne, Ontario, was a ghost town beside a quarry, and the Lafarge cement operations now ran from Bath, where, as the company would later put it, descendants of the Point Anne plant continued to find work. The 1974 expansion at Exshaw followed the same logic. The Bow Valley plant was to be enlarged, modernized, made into the largest cement works in the country. To make room for the new construction, the company needed land it did not own, the land directly south of the existing plant, where the original 1906 company town of Exshaw stood. 47 houses, the elementary school, the Protestant chapel of St. Bernard, where Secondos Maniotto's wrought iron gates hung at the entrance, the last building of the original uptown. The residents were given notice. The company bought them out. The bulldozers came in through the winter of 1974 and the spring of 1975. The school was torn down. The houses were torn down. The chapel, St. Bernard's, was the last to go. Families who had lived on Portland Avenue for 2 and 3 generations stood at the new fence line and watched the streets they had grown up on disappear. The company built new housing further up the valley. Some of the families took it, some did not. The point, in retrospect, was not that the expansion was wrong. The Exshaw Works did need to be modernized, and is today, Canada's largest cement plant. The point was that the calculation had been made in a boardroom in Paris and Montreal by men who had never walked on Portland Avenue, and that the affection a community had built up over 70 years for the streets and the chapel and the school was simply not part of the calculation. In the meantime, Lafarge in Paris was growing. Marcel Demonque retired in 1974 and was succeeded by Olivier Le Cerf, who flew back from Montreal to take the chairman's seat. Le Cerf brought with him a vision of what Lafarge was going to become. Not a French cement company with international operations, but a global cement company that happened to be French. He doubled the firm's output through the late 1970s. He pushed into Brazil. He pushed into West Africa. He pushed, above all, into the United States. The North American market, 5 times the size of France's, dominated by a fragmented industry of mid-sized producers, was the strategic prize, and the Canadian operation was the platform from which the prize would be taken. In 1973, Canada Cement Lafarge formed a joint venture in Atlanta, Georgia, called Citadel Cement Corporation, in partnership with the American firm Lone Star Industries. When that partnership dissolved in 1977, CCL kept Citadel. It was the company's first American plant. Within 5 years, it would be the foundation of an American holding company, and within 15 years, it would swallow the Canadian parent that had built it. The men running the Canadian plants did not see this coming. The boardroom in Montreal did not see it coming. They saw record sales, rising prices, full order books for the new Olympic Stadium concrete, and the CN Tower pour. They saw an industry that, despite the oil shock, was selling everything it could make. They saw, when they bothered to look at the parent company's balance sheet in Paris, that Lafarge's North American strategy was driving the firm's profits, and that the Canadian operation was a key piece of that strategy. They did not see that the center of gravity had begun to shift, that the men in the Avenue Foch office in Paris were no longer talking about Canada Cement Lafarge as a Canadian subsidiary with a French partner, but as a North American platform with a Canadian heritage. The platform, in their language. The heritage, in their language. Heritage is what you put in a museum. It is not what you put on the door of a head office. Chapter 10. The Texas Calculation. By 1981, Olivier Le Cerf had been running Lafarge from Paris for 7 years, and he was ready to make the move he had been preparing all along. The cement industry in the United States was in trouble. The American economy was in the second of 2 back-to-back recessions. Mortgage rates had touched 18%, and construction had collapsed. Cement plants from Texas to Pennsylvania were running at half capacity. Share prices had fallen by half from their late 1970s peaks. The kind of acquisition that would have cost $1 billion in 1979 could now be done for less than $400 million. The target Le Cerf wanted was General Portland Inc., a Dallas-based firm with 10 cement plants and the capacity to produce 6 million tons of cement a year. It was the second largest cement producer in the United States. It was, by any standard, a major acquisition. A company in its own right, with its own history and its own engineering culture and its own management. It was also, at the depressed prices of 1981, available. The bid was made through Canada Cement Lafarge. The Canadian subsidiary, in other words, would borrow the money to buy the American target. The logic of this maneuver was straightforward enough. CCL was a public company listed on the Montreal Exchange, with a balance sheet large enough to support the borrowing, and an existing American foothold in the Citadel plant in Atlanta. It was the cleanest path to the prize. The transaction closed in 1982 at a price of $326 million. General Portland was now a subsidiary of Canada Cement Lafarge. On paper, the Canadian company had just doubled in size and become a major North American player. In practice, something different was happening. Canada Cement Lafarge had borrowed heavily to make the purchase, and the timing of the borrowing was, in financial terms, catastrophic. The American recession of 1981 and 1982 was the worst since the Depression. Cement sales in both Canada and the United States fell, then fell again. In 1982, the first full year that the merged operation owned General Portland, Canada Cement Lafarge reported a loss of $25 million on revenues of about $900 million. The newly acquired American subsidiary was bleeding cash. The debt service on the acquisition was hanging like a weight from the company's neck. There was an obvious solution. The company could go back to the equity markets, Canadian or American or both, and raise new capital. It could issue shares. It could dilute the existing owners and bring in fresh money. This was, in normal times, what large industrial firms did when they had overborrowed for an acquisition. But the Canadian equity markets in 1982 were not deep enough. Canada Cement Lafarge, even with its dominant national market share, was too small a company in too small a market to absorb a major new share issue. The math, as Lafarge's vice president of investor relations would later put it bluntly to Fortune magazine. We just couldn't raise enough equity in Canada. What LeSurf proposed instead was a corporate restructuring. It was presented as a financial engineering maneuver, a tidying up of the corporate structure to better reflect the geographic distribution of the company's operations. The American assets, it was argued, were now too large to sit as a subsidiary of a Canadian parent. They should be reorganized into a separate American holding company, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, capable of raising American equity for American expansion. In February 1983, the Atlanta-based Citadel Cement Corporation was renamed Lafarge Corporation. In April 1983, Lafarge Copé, the Paris parent, executed a stock exchange with 5 French banks that gave the newly renamed Lafarge Corporation a 69% ownership stake in Canada Cement Lafarge. The Canadian company was now a subsidiary of an American holding company that was, in turn, controlled by a French parent and 5 Paris banks. Read that sentence twice. It is the entire decline in a single line. The head office of Lafarge Corporation was placed in Dallas, Texas, where General Portland's offices already stood. The Canadian operations, 11 plants, 4,000 workers, a head office on Phillips Square, were now reporting to Dallas. The cement that paved Canada was being supervised from a glass tower in North Dallas by executives most of whom had never been north of Buffalo. McIntyre was, by this point, no longer chairman. He had retired in 1984, and the chair had passed to a French Lafarge man named Bertrand Colombe, an engineer, ex-Polytechnique, who had been put in to integrate the General Portland acquisition with the rest of the North American business. Colombe was thoughtful, well-spoken, fluent in English, perfectly capable of presenting himself to a Canadian Senate committee or a Quebec radio interviewer as a sympathetic friend of the Canadian operation. He was also, by training and by inclination, the architect of the centralization that was about to swallow it. In 1987, Colombe completed the integration. Canada Cement Lafarge and General Portland were combined under a single management structure. The Atlanta operations and the Dallas operations and the Montreal operations and the Vancouver operations would all now report to a single head office. Colombe himself was named vice chairman and chief executive officer of the combined group. Robert Murdoch, the former head of Canada Cement Lafarge, a Canadian, a long-serving company man, was named president and chief operating officer. The new corporate headquarters would not be in Montreal. It would not be in Dallas. It would be in Reston, Virginia, in the bedroom suburbs of Washington, in a glass office building Colombe had selected for its proximity to the federal regulatory apparatus. There was a small ceremony at the new Reston offices. Colombe had ordered framed cement bags from each of the company's heritage plants hung in the entrance hallway. A row of bags from Canada Cement, from General Portland, from Citadel, from the older mid-sized firms the company had absorbed over the years. He described it, to a Wall Street Journal reporter who visited the new offices that autumn, as an honor roll of small companies that were now part of Lafarge. That was the language. A row of empty cement bags in a hallway in Virginia, hung up as decoration. A national company reduced to a memorial of itself. The men running the Canadian plants did not, for the most part, attend the Reston opening. They were too far away, and the cement still had to be made. Chapter 11. The name comes down. The final step in the decline was almost an afterthought. In December 1987, the board of Canada Cement Lafarge, by this point a wholly controlled subsidiary of a French-owned American holding company, approved a resolution to change the name of the Canadian operating entity. The historic name, the resolution noted, no longer reflected the company's parentage or its relationship to the larger Lafarge corporate family. A simpler, more consistent corporate identity would be adopted across all the firm's national markets. Effective the 1st of January, 1988, Canada Cement Lafarge Limited would be renamed Lafarge Canada Inc. The name Canada Cement, the name Max Aitken had given the combine in 1909, the name that had been on the bags of cement that built the Welland Canal and the Quebec Bridge and the Beauharnois Dam and the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Trans-Canada Highway and the CN Tower, would be retired. There was no announcement of any consequence in the Canadian press. The change appeared in the Globe and Mail's business section in a one-paragraph item 3 days into the new year. There was no public consultation, no protest from a shareholders' association. The Canadian shareholders were, by then, a small minority. The Quebec government did not object. The federal government did not object. There was nothing to object to. The company was no longer Canadian. The name had ceased to mean anything to its owners, and so they had taken it down. A retired Plant No. 1 supervisor named Réal Lemieux read the item in La Presse one morning over coffee. He had retired in 1979 after 31 years on the kilns at Pointe-aux-Trembles. He was 76 years old. He folded the paper and set it down on the kitchen table. His wife asked him what was wrong. He told her the company didn't exist anymore. She said, "Of course it exists. They still make cement." He said, "That's not what I mean." It was not what he meant. The plants kept running. The men kept punching in. The bags kept coming off the line. The product was still going out to the foundations of the Sky Dome in Toronto, which was rising that year on the lakefront beside the CN Tower, to the Confederation Bridge between New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, which would begin construction in 1993, to the airports being expanded for the deregulation era, to the prisons and the schools and the parking garages. The cement was unchanged. What had changed was the name on the bag. By 1990, the Lafarge Canada plants were operating under a parent, Lafarge Corporation of Reston, Virginia, whose American shareholders held the majority of the stock and whose French ultimate parent in Paris held the controlling block. By 2001, Lafarge in Paris had acquired Britain's Blue Circle Industries, the great British cement firm that had been the largest producer in the Commonwealth for most of the 20th century, and had become the largest cement maker on Earth. By 2006, the Paris parent took full control of Lafarge North America in a $3 billion tender offer and delisted it from the New York Stock Exchange. The American holding company that had once owned the Canadian subsidiary that had once owned the General Portland plants was folded back into the French head office. The Reston headquarters was eventually wound down. In 2015, Lafarge in Paris merged with Holcim of Switzerland to form Lafarge Holcim, a Zurich-listed cement and aggregates giant with operations in 80 countries. The Canadian plants were now reporting to Zurich. In 2021, the firm was renamed simply Holcim Group, dropping the Lafarge half of the name in another corporate rebranding that took place without consulting anyone in Pointe-aux-Trembles or Exshaw or Bath. In June 2025, Holcim announced the spin-off of its entire North American business into a separate corporate entity, listed on the New York and Swiss exchanges under the ticker AMRZ. The new company was called Amrize Lienedit. Its operational headquarters were placed in Chicago. It was, on the day of its listing, the largest cement producer in North America. The Canadian operations, the plants at Exshaw and Bath and St. Constant and Brookfield, the ready-mix and aggregates yards, the Phillips Square office building still standing on Cathcart Street, now reported to Chicago, under a brand name that had not existed 48 hours before its listing. Amrize, coined in a marketing office, no connection to anything, no echo of Aitken or Beaverbrook or Stairs or any of the men who had built the company over a century of operation. No connection even to Lafarge or Holcim, the previous owners whose names had been retired in their turn. This is the part where the prosecutor and the eulogist would want to raise his voice. He does not. There is no one to raise his voice at. What happened to the Canada Cement Company is what happens, often, in the long history of branch plant economies. A Canadian asset is absorbed into a larger continental or global structure, and then absorbed again and again, and the name on the original deed becomes a footnote, and then less than a footnote. The men in Paris in 1983 were not malicious. The men in Reston in 1987 were not malicious. Bertrand Collomb went on to a distinguished career as chairman of Lafarge through the 1990s and 2000s, and died in 2019 with eulogies in the French and English press that called him a great industrialist. He was a great industrialist. He also presided over the corporate maneuver that erased the name of a national Canadian company. Both of these things can be true at the same time, and were. Chapter 12. The Bulldozers Come to Exshaw. The Decline of Canada Cement. As a corporate name was a paper event. Boardroom resolutions, stock exchange filings, press releases nobody read. The decline of the cement towns was something else entirely. At Point Anne, Ontario, the closure had come in 1973, and the demolition had followed through the rest of the 1970s. By 1980, the town was effectively gone. A few of the original cement block houses still stood, the ones that residents had bought from the company and held on to. But most were torn down. The school was gone. The clubhouse was gone. The hockey rink the Hull brothers had learned to skate on was gone. The ball diamond where the Canada Cementmen had won the Ontario Championship in 1939 was overgrown. The bleachers rusted. The outfield fence collapsed in long sections into the long grass. Chester Shepard, the second-generation kiln man, had bought his row house from the company and stayed. He served on the Point Anne Water Commission. He died in 2006. His widow Clara stayed in the same house. There were perhaps a dozen households left in what had once been a community of 600. Bobby Hull, asked once in a televised interview where he was from, said, "Point Anne." The interviewer asked where that was. Hull thought about it. He said, "It's near Belleville. There used to be a cement plant." At Exshaw, the demolition came in two waves. The first was in 1974 and 1975. The bulldozing of Uptown, the 47 houses on Portland Avenue, the elementary school, St. Bernard's Chapel with its wrought iron gates. The second was a slower process through the 1990s and 2000s, as the plant expanded again, and the company bought out the remaining nearby properties. By 2010, the original 1906 settlement of Exshaw was nothing but a memory in the local history book Heart of the Valley, which the Exshaw Historical Society published in 2005, 712 pages, compiled by Rob Alexander and Dean Cooper, of photographs and oral histories and architectural records of a place that no longer existed. The plant itself, in the same period, was modernized. Between 2013 and 2017, Lafarge Canada, under the Holcim ownership of those years, invested more than $500 million in the Exshaw works. New kilns, new grinding mills, new environmental controls. The expanded plant produced 2.2 million tons of cement a year. It was Canada's largest cement plant. It employed about 160 workers. 160. In 1969, the company had employed roughly 4,000 across 11 plants. By the mid-2020s, the entire Canadian operation employed fewer people than a single mid-sized regional law firm. The Woodstock, Ontario plant, opened in the 1950s, never one of the company's flagships, was shut down around 2008. The Saint-Constant, Quebec plant remained the company's main Quebec operation. The Bath plant on the Bay of Quinte still ran, still employed, as the Lafarge Corporate Communications put it, descendants of the Point Anne plant. There were still cement workers in Canada. There were just very many fewer of them. The Sanford-Fleming dispute had ended in 1911 with a deal whereby Aitken stayed in Britain to keep an inquiry from happening. The Bertrand Collomb restructuring had ended in 1988 with a paragraph in the Globe and Mail business section. Between those two events lay 79 years of one of the great industrial companies in Canadian history. A company that had supplied the cement for everything the country had built across 3/4 of a century, and which, by the end, was a regional plant network, reporting first to Paris, then to Reston, then to Zurich, and finally to Chicago. Chapter 13. What we built drive across Canada today, and you cannot avoid Canada Cement. You cannot drive the Trans-Canada Highway from St. John's to Victoria without rolling on its product. You cannot cross the St. Lawrence on the locks at Côte Sainte-Catherine, or the Snell, or the Eisenhower, without floating between walls of its concrete. You cannot stand at the foot of the CN Tower in Toronto without looking up at 40,500 cubic meters of single-source, on-site mixed concrete poured between February 1973 and the spring of 1975 by Canada Cement crews. You cannot enter the locks at Iroquois on the Seaway without driving over its powder. You can walk through the Toronto Dominion Centre, or Place Ville-Marie, or Habitat 67. You can ride the Montreal Metro under the river. You can drive the Lions Gate Bridge approaches in Vancouver, or the Quebec Bridge approaches above the St. Lawrence, or the Confederation Bridge approaches at either end. You can climb the Manic 5 Dam in northern Quebec, one of the largest concrete dams in the world, and run your hand along its arched buttress. The cement is everywhere. The name is nowhere. Most Canadians under 50 have never heard of the Canada Cement Company. They have never heard of Max Aitken's Combine, or of the 1909 merger, or of Sanford Fleming's protest, or of the company town at Point Anne. They have not heard of the Bath plant, or the Exshaw Works, or Plant Number 1 at Pointe-aux-Trembles. They drive on the company's product every day of their lives, and they have no idea the company existed. This is what happens in a branch plant economy to a Canadian industrial firm that is allowed to drift into foreign ownership. It does not necessarily close. It does not necessarily fail. Its plants keep running, and its workers keep working, and its product keeps going out. What it loses is its name. What it loses is the public memory of itself. The Canada Cement Building still stands at the corner of Phillips Square in downtown Montreal. 10 stories of reinforced concrete dressed in hand-tooled granite, designed by Ernest Barat in 1921, the first all-concrete office tower the city ever built. The square outside it was redeveloped in 2020 and 2021 with new paving and new trees and a new public art installation. Most of the people who walk through the square on a summer afternoon do not look up at the building. The address, 606 Cathcart Street, is occupied today by offices of various kinds. There is no plaque on the door commemorating what was once headquartered inside. The Exshaw plant runs. It is the largest cement plant in the country. 160 workers come through its gates every morning. The Bow River runs past it. The Three Sisters stand above it. The Trans-Canada Highway passes within a few hundred meters of the site. The drivers on the highway, most of them, do not know that the cement under their tires probably came from the very plant they are driving past. The Bath plant on the Bay of Quinte runs. The Brookfield, Nova Scotia, plant runs. The St. Constant, Quebec, plant runs. The Joliet plant runs. The cement is being made. The product is going out. What is missing is the company. You can stand at the site of Point Anne today and find very little. There is a quarry, still operated by the Lafarge division of Amrise, where the original Plant Number 5 used to be. There are the remains of some of the cement block houses, a few still inhabited. There is a sign at the edge of what used to be the town. Point Anne, the sign says, just the words, and a small parquet where the hockey rink the Hull brothers learned on once stood. In the winter, when the wind comes off the bay, you can hear it move through the few remaining trees and across the long grass and the rusted bleachers, and you can think, if you know the history, about the men who used to walk the streets that aren't there anymore, on their way to a plant that isn't there anymore, to make a product they put on a bag that hasn't existed in nearly 40 years. At Exshaw, the contrast is sharper. The plant is enormous, modern, profitable, the largest of its kind in the country. The community around it is a fraction of what it was. The original uptown, the 47 houses on Portland Avenue, the school, St. Bernard's Chapel, is gone. Where it stood is now plant property. A few of the older residents in the new houses further up the valley can still take you to the place where the chapel used to be, and tell you about Secondo Smaniato's wrought iron gates, and about the welder sculptor who circled the world to end up back here. In Newcastle, New Brunswick, today part of the city of Miramichi, the bronze bust of Lord Beaverbrook still stands in the central square. the ashes of Max Aitken, are in the plinth. He looks out across the Miramichi River toward the shore where the schooners used to load square timber for Liverpool. He was, when he died in 1964, the most famous Canadian in Britain, a cabinet minister, a press baron, a confidant of Churchill, a peer of the realm. He was, on the day of his death, very nearly forgotten in the country he had left in 1910. The company he had assembled in the summer of 1909 was at its peak. The men who ran it had taken his combine and turned it into the largest industrial firm of its kind in the country. He had given them the name. They had given the name everything else. The name came down on the 1st of January, 1988. Not in a great catastrophe, not in a bankruptcy, not in a hostile takeover that made headlines for weeks. It came down because the men who controlled the shares, sitting in Paris, in Dallas, in Reston, looked at the letterhead and decided it no longer matched their corporate plan. It came down the way most Canadian industrial names have come down, in the long branch plant century. Quietly, by accountant's decision, in a paragraph nobody reads. What remains is the product. The roads, the bridges, the dams, the towers, the locks, the airports, the foundations under the houses, the curbs along the streets, the sidewalks the children walk to school on. The gray powder that Max Aitken's plants began producing in the autumn of 1909 is now embedded so completely in the physical fabric of Canada that there is no possibility of separating it out. A century and more of Canadian construction is built on the company's cement. You walk on it every day. You drive on it every day. You sleep in buildings whose foundations are made of it. You cross rivers on bridges whose piers are made of it. You have, almost certainly, never heard the company's name. That is what was built. That is what was lost. Not a plant, not a workforce, not even, in the end, a balance sheet. Amrize's quarterly reports show healthy margins on the same cement that comes out of the same Canadian kilns. What was lost was the Canadian ownership of a Canadian story. What was lost was the memory of the men in Pointe-aux-Trembles who ran the kilns for 30 years, the welder in Exshaw who made the chapel gates, the second-generation kiln man at Point Anne who chipped the dust off his garage roof every couple of years. What was lost was the sense, palpable in the company's 1956 shareholder rolls, with their 13,000 owners, 97% of them Canadian, that a great industrial firm could be of this country, and from this country, and for this country, and could carry its name on every bag that left every plant for 8 decades. That is what came down on the 1st of January, 1988. Not the plants. The plants are still running. Not the work. The work is still being done. Not the cement. The cement is still being poured. Just the name. Just the country on the side of the bag. Just everything that turned a financial combine into a national company.